Hi, everyone, and thank you again for coming this evening. This has been co-sponsored by Brooklyn for Peace and CodePink, and the Brooklyn Friends meeting here has very generously allowed us to use their space. We're talking tonight, we have Bill Hartung, who many of you know from his many years of studying military spending and where the money comes from and where it goes. He'll be speaking tonight. But we'll also hear speakers about two campaigns that are going on, Divest from the War Machine and Move the Money, which is specifically working on a resolution before the New York City Council to demand that Congress start sending New Yorkers' tax dollars to the cities where we need it, instead of blowing it up in various countries throughout the world, in almost every country in the world. And so we'll be talking about that. And then afterwards, we're going to break up, we're going to try something new. We're going to break up into working groups around the kinds of work that has to be done to get this campaign going, like legislative efforts, media and design, social media, doing research to find out exactly where the money is going, what military contractors are getting what money. The fourth one, of course, is legislation and lobbying. We hope to be able to set up visits with every Brooklyn council member and have constituents from that council member present and saying, we want you to co-sponsor this resolution before it comes up so that it does get out of committee, and we want it voted on before the full council, and we want there to be hearings so that city people can testify about what unmet needs they have so that they can hear where that money is going. So this is an important start, and if we could pull this off, if the city of New York actually passed such a resolution, that would be a much needed boost to the peace movement. So with that, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Bill Hartung. He is the director of the Arms and Security Project at the Center for International Policy and a senior advisor to the Center's Security Assistance Monitor. He's the author of Prophets of War, Lockheed Martin, and the Making of the Military-Industrial Complex. This book has been out for a while. Our program coordinator, Emily Beck, who many of you have met in the back, has told us that when she was a student at Hofstra, several chapters of it were required reading. So this is really a basic text about the military-industrial complex, and it's available in local bookstores and it's available online. Bill has been a featured expert on national security issues on CBS 60 Minutes, NBC Nightly News, the PBS NewsHour, CNN, Fox News, and scores of local, regional, and international radio outlets. He blogs for the Huffington Post, The Hill, and The Medium. So I'd like you all to welcome Bill Hartung.
Usually when I'm waiting to give a speech, somebody's saying all this nice stuff. I'm like, who are they talking about? That person sounds really interesting. And then I realize it's myself. I'm like, But anyway, so I'm here to talk about the Pentagon budget, and we're trying to deal with its impact on New York and Brooklyn. So of course the question is, how much are we spending? And the short answer is too much. And on my little sheet, I've got 5 exclamation points. But since I'm sort of a mild-mannered guy, just imagine exclamation points, too much. Trump's most recent proposal was $750 billion for the Pentagon and related work at the Department of Energy, where they make nuclear warheads. That's more than we spent at the height of Vietnam, height of the Korean War, the Reagan buildup. It's one of the highest levels in history. And this is from a guy who said he was going to end endless wars. Of course, none of us believed that, but he did say it once. And that chews up a lot of money. It's 57 cents on the dollar of our discretionary budget, which is basically everything but Medicare and Social Security, things that have their own revenue stream that are called entitlement programs. But most of the things government does, environmental protection, administration of justice, housing, transit, labor rights, all is in that discretionary budget. So basically, the Pentagon gets more than everything else the government does combined. And it's getting worse. It was, 54 cents on the dollar. Trump's new budget is 57 cents on the dollar. And it's more than the next 7 countries in the world spend combined. It's about 3 times what China spends. And of course, those 7 countries are mostly US allies, NATO allies. So if you just look at the kind of NATO alone, it spends 3 times as much as Russia. US spends 10 times as much. So the idea that the Pentagon doesn't have enough money, of course, is hogwash. But if you go inside the bubble of Washington, D.C., you'll hear all these generals and weapons executives and so forth saying that our military has been decimated, because they wanted, this many trillion, and they got just a little bit less, and so therefore they feel like they've been cheated out of their, their right, basically, to our money. So another way to look at it is, it's been a big buildup since Trump came in. The last 2 years, just the increase in Pentagon spending, not even the base, is as much as Russia spends on its entire military budget. So it's a lot of money, and we have many other good uses for it, as you'll hear from the folks who are going to speak later. So, before I get into all the further depressing details, I think we should remember that people are starting to fight back in a lot of different ways. The Poor People's Campaign, which Reverend William Barber helped to start, which is a kind of continuation of the legacy of Martin Luther King, dealing with racism, poverty, and militarism, and adding the environment and protecting the environment, which was not part of King's original Poor People's Campaign. They have been working with some colleagues of mine to develop a platform, and their platform calls for cutting $200 billion a year from the Pentagon, about $2 trillion over the next decade, which would be enough to do many, many things. You could have free college for, public college for kids. We could rebuild our transit systems. All the things that the government says we can't afford would be on the table, would be possible. Of course, we also need to tax the rich, but that's another talk. And then Public Citizen, which is the Nader group that's been around for many years, is now talking about working on this issue and getting groups that don't normally talk about the Pentagon budget to press presidential candidates to take a stand in favor of cutting the Pentagon budget. I'm part of a group called the Pentagon Budget Campaign, which includes Peace Action, Friends Committee on National Legislation, some conservative taxpayer groups, and they just sent a note up to the Hill saying, we should cut at least $150 billion from this year's budget for the Pentagon, if not more. So there's work going on, and you're going to hear about the CodePink Divest from the War Machine campaign, the Move the Money campaign. So I think that, the good news, to the extent that there is, when they're stealing this much of our money for these terrible purposes, is that I think we have a chance to get somewhat of a ripple effect going and actually put some movement behind this issue. If you think about some of the other issues in the campaign, there's Medicare for all, there's the Green New Deal. There's no sort of comparable call to cut the Pentagon, to sort of balance those other two. And it's directly related, because we're not going to be able to afford Medicaid for all or the Green New Deal if we're going to blow $7 trillion on the Pentagon in the next decade. So I think candidates are going to start to see that, and they're going to get pressure from progressives, particularly there's some progressives in Congress, some of the new members, who are not willing to stand for business as usual when it comes to the Pentagon. So I think that's a hopeful note. Now the question is what to cut. And one way to do it is just kind of like what you would do with your kid. Just say to the Pentagon, this is your allowance, and this is all you're getting, so you figure it out. But I don't think it's going to happen that way. But I think, obviously, if you're going to reduce the Pentagon budget, you got to stop our policy of endless war. We're at war in at least 7 countries. We're also have counterterrorism operations in at least 80 countries. We spend special forces to do something or other in over 100 countries every year. Could be training, could be hunting terrorists, could be, goodwill tours. They don't even tell us exactly what they're up to, but basically it's this global reach. 800 military bases, largest arms supplying country in the world. All these things cost huge amounts of money, but they're premised on the idea that the United States somehow has the right to police the world. And of course, that is not the case. And, policeman may not be the right term because it makes it sound like law enforcement. We're just enforcing the rules here. But of course, a lot of what we do breaks the rules of international law and causes tremendous devastation. There's a project at Brown University called the Cost of War Project. And they tried to figure out how much we've spent on the post-9/11 wars. The cost of actually fighting in the war zones, the increases of the Pentagon budget to support that, the cost of taking care of the vets coming home from the wars, the increase in our interest on our debt because we're basically putting these wars on a big credit card. All these things combined came out to $5.9 trillion, including about $1 trillion yet to be spent to take care of the vets who are going to need our help for many years to come. They also found out that by their conservative estimate, more than 350,000 people have died in these wars, most of them civilians. If you look at veterans in the United States, there's hundreds of thousands of vets with disabilities. So not only were thousands killed, tens of thousands wounded on the battlefield, but if you look at things like traumatic brain injuries, post-traumatic stress syndrome, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of veterans who need care. And the Veterans Administration budget has tripled since 2001, and it's not enough to keep up. And of course, there's other issues with the bureaucracy and so forth, which could be talked about at some length. So you got to stop the wars. You got to cut the number of troops if you're really going to save money at the Pentagon. And then there's the nuclear weapons buildup, which the Pentagon started under the Obama administration and has been ratcheted up a notch by the Trump administration. And basically anything to do with nuclear weapons, they want more. They want new ballistic missile submarines, new nuclear bombers, new land-based missiles, new cruise missiles that fly from under the wings of the planes, small missiles that can come off of submarines, a so-called low-yield nuclear weapon, which basically, it's very hard to kind of enter into the twisted logic of Washington, but basically the argument they made is, well, they're not going to believe we're going to use the big ones, so we need smaller ones, and then we'll really scare them that we might use them. And of course, part of that logic is you might end up using them. They're sort of called, by the critics on the Hill, these are more usable nuclear weapons, which is the last thing in the world that we want. So all of that could be stopped. And they want to spend $1.5 trillion on that over the next 3 decades. So another huge store of money that we could use for something else. Then there's just the waste, which is quite substantial. All right. All right, we're all being recorded now. So we better watch our words. So, for example, the Pentagon has this little board. It's called the Defense Business Board, and they're supposed to look at efficiency at the Pentagon. And so they figured out they could save $125 billion over 5 years just by getting rid of excess bureaucracy. 2 people doing the same job, some people doing no work. They also have employed at least 600,000 private contractors, a lot of whom do the same jobs that the government employees do. And they've got so many of these contractors, they actually can't keep an accurate count. Robert Gates, when he was defense secretary, was asked, how many of these contractors does the Pentagon pay for? He said, well, I really don't know. At least 600,000. And, to kind of add to that, the Pentagon's the only major federal agency that's never passed an audit. So they can't actually tell us how they're spending the money. And in the last 5 years, they've actually given back about $80 billion to the Treasury. Basically, we gave them so much money, they didn't know what to do with it. And so they handed it back. So this doesn't sound like an agency that's, on hard times. But if you went to Washington, this is what you would hear from the generals, the admirals, the head of the Secretary of Defense, and so forth. So there's many reasons for this. I think the biggest one is just kind of a nation addicted to war. But then there's the domestic front and the military-industrial complex. And, so we're up against some powerful interests and a lot of money. The defense industry, taken as a whole, all the companies that make weapons, spent about $35 million on elections in the last 2 cycles, which is a lot more than, say, peace action spent. Although maybe we're catching up, who knows? And then lobbying, they spend about 10 times that, $375 million just in the last 4 years. And a lot of this goes to very well-connected lobbyists. People basically go from, the Pentagon or the State Department or the Department of Energy or the White House, and they go work as lobbyists or executives for Lockheed Martin and Boeing, Northrop Grumman, all the big weapons contractors. And so what they do is basically, they're wired. Their old friends are still in government. They're basically saying to them, look, cut us some slack here. When you leave government, you can have a job like mine, making 10 times what you're making now. So there's kind of a corruption or capture of government through this system, which is called the revolving door. And it works both ways. People come from government to lobby for industry, and then people come from industry to run the government. So for example, the Secretary of Defense, acting secretary, Patrick Shanahan, was an executive at Boeing for 30 years. And he ran their missile defense division, which is not exactly an advertisement for letting somebody run something, given that they've spent hundreds of billions of dollars in missile defense and never had a single realistic success, even in testing. So you've got a Boeing guy running the Pentagon. You've got a Lockheed Martin guy as number 3. You've got Secretary of the Air Force, who just left, was a lobbyist for Lockheed Martin, involved in a no-show job scandal. So you've got basically contractors running the Pentagon, and then you've got these people who've come from government, and they collude. And this is what Eisenhower was really talking about when he talked about the military-industrial complex. And it adds up to a lot of people. The industry has somewhere between 700 and 1,000 lobbyists running around the Hill. So that's, almost 2 for every member of Congress. And that doesn't count people like consultants and, board members, and other people who do lobbying but don't register as lobbyists. So there's that element. There's the lobbying, and there's the big money flow into Washington. And then there's argument. Their kind of argument of last resort is, oh, come on, you can't stop spending this money because it'll cost jobs. And, there's no question there's jobs involved. I mean, you can't build an airplane out of thin air. But almost anything else you do with the same amount of money creates more jobs. If you, invested in green energy or education or rebuilding infrastructure, you get about 1.5 to 2 times as many jobs as you get from building weapons. But the problem is they've kind of, they sort of got us by the neck, because the Congress refuses to invest in the things we need. And so people are left with the money from the Pentagon as well. This is what the government's doling out. I need a piece of that. So until we have a change in Washington of our priorities, it's going to be very hard to tackle that jobs argument, even though there's many better ways to employ people. And then I think, one of the biggest things is just fear-mongering. Everywhere you turn, they're saying, there's a book called, a friend of mine wrote, Michael Cohen, Clear and Present Safety. And it's basically about how the world is a lot less dangerous than the Pentagon would have you believe. China's not going to get up in our grill, and they're not going to bomb our country. And North Korea is a relatively small country that really couldn't attack the United States without being completely wiped off the map. And they sort of walk through the different reasons why we don't have to be as afraid of the world as the Pentagon would like us to believe. And it's not just the Pentagon. There's a lot of the think tanks in Washington are funded by contractors. They're basically funded to scream from the rooftops that we're not safe. And if you hear some of the testimony in Congress, some of the generals and former secretaries of defense say, this is the most dangerous moment in my lifetime. Some of these guys are older than me, and I'm not a spring chicken anymore. Some of them lived through World War II. They lived through Nagasaki. They lived through the Nazi invasion of Europe. You can't tell me this is a more dangerous time than that was. But it's not really about reality. It's about, it's a selling job. Fear sells if you want to get more money for the Pentagon. And the most recent example of that is a little thing called the National Defense Strategy Commission. Congress appointed these experts to look at the Pentagon's defense strategy and say, is this realistic? And most of the experts were on the payroll of the defense industry. So they looked at the Pentagon strategy and said, oh no, that's a terrible strategy. We're not spending enough. And so they recommended a 3 to 5% increase above inflation for the Pentagon for the foreseeable future, which would push that $750 billion budget I talked about to close to $1 trillion within 5 years. And it's, they talk about stuff like, well, we couldn't possibly win a war with China and also be ready to fight Russia. Well, I'm not that worried about that, because if we start a war with China, like nuclear armed power, it's not going to last very long. We're going to be risking World War III. So the strategy shouldn't be like, how do you win a war against China? It's got to be, how do you prevent a war with China? And that's not about putting ships right against their shore. It's not about building more nuclear weapons. It's not about coming up with all these war games of how you would defeat them. It's about finding ways to cooperate. We could cooperate on climate change. We could come up with some more reasonable economic interaction than the kind of trade wars that Trump is talking about. Basically look for positive grounds for cooperation, which is possible to do. I mean, even at the height of the Cold War, there were certain areas where the US and the Soviet Union cooperated, including arms control. The whole kind of thesis of this commission, which the hawks in Congress keep pointing to and say, well, the commission says we're not spending enough, is basically to scare the hell out of us on behalf of the people who pay their salaries. They would not admit that. They would say they're doing a very careful, objective analysis of, the world situation. But of course they're going to say that. What's our way forward? I think I'm really glad there's a couple campaigns here to talk about what they're doing, and that there's things to do at the local level that'll kind of percolate upwards. And the thing is, the public is with us on this. There's a group called the Eurasia Group, which did a poll asking people about Pentagon spending. 3/4 of them said we're spending plenty enough or too much. So there's a base there to work with. But there's a couple things that happen. One is people say, oh, come on, Bill, it's a very powerful set of interests you're talking about. We're not going to beat them, So some people are just discouraged. They've sort of taken themselves out of the political game. And then also, people need a little more to work with, a little more information. Because when you do polls and you say, we're spending $750 billion on the Pentagon, here's what that would buy you in terms of new housing, environmental protection, how many jobs it would create if you spend it elsewhere. You give people a little information about what that amount means, and the numbers of people who say we should cut the Pentagon go way up. And if you ask people what we're spending, they would probably say, oh, I don't know, 100, 200 billion, maybe a third of what we're spending. And they think we're spending all our money on the State Department, which of course is being cut dramatically under Trump. So I think there's a base to be worked with. I think some of these campaigns are going to start to get traction. And I think, as I mentioned before, we have to think big. When the closer you get to Washington, the smaller and smaller the demands are. So it becomes like, well, let's cut $10 million from this program for a $2 billion new nuclear weapon, and see if we can get enough votes to make a respectable showing and so forth, and then lose anyway. But I think if people are willing to go out and say, we need Medicare for all, we need a Green New Deal, we have to be able to say we're going to make deep cuts in the Pentagon, we're going to invest in things we need, and that's only going to happen from people working locally and kind of pushing that demand up or down or over wherever Washington is. And so I think then also we have to keep standing up against the fear campaign. There's $9 billion in the Pentagon budget to build Trump's wall. And of course, he was making all kinds of statements about, the men, women, and children who are fleeing poverty and violence to try to protect their families, being, infiltrated with terrorists, invading the country, sending troops to the border. So he's got the thinnest of arguments, but he's still scared some of his base. They still believe this. And so we have to push back against that. We have to push back against his Muslim ban. We have to basically say, look, we're all together in this, The people coming into our country are not our enemies. The enemy is the Pentagon. It's this overspending on war. That's what's killing people. And we have to push our representatives to be leaders, because New York, we have a fair number of liberal reps, and they'll usually vote the right way if actually a vote comes up that's relevant. But they shouldn't just be sitting back and waiting for a vote. They should be demanding a vote. They should be putting forward legislation. They should be real leaders on this, not just kind of occasionally pull a lever or put their marker down for a vote. And the last thing I'll say is, in terms of things that have been encouraging to me in the last year or two, there's this awful war in Yemen that Saudi Arabia has been waging, killing thousands of people with U.S. supplied bombs, blockading the country so humanitarian aid can't get in, bombing sewage treatment plants and water treatment plants so there's been a cholera outbreak. It's the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, and it's made in the USA. And when the war started in 2015, there were one or two members of Congress speaking up about it, including Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut. This last year, we got both houses of Congress to vote under the War Powers Resolution for the United States to stop supporting Saudi Arabia in that war. Now, of course, this being Washington, nothing's ever over. So Trump vetoed the bill. So now we have to either get an override or we have to take the money away in some other fashion. But the point is, where there were a handful of members of Congress 3 or 4 years ago, they got a majority even in the Republican Senate to say this war has to stop. And that's because of the work of a lot of groups like Peace Action, like the Friends Committee on National Legislation, like Oxfam, my colleagues at a group called Win Without War. There was this kind of unique coalition of human rights groups, humanitarian aid groups, and peace groups working together in ways that they had not in recent times to move that issue forward. So I think there's, those kinds of things are sparks of hope. And the truth of the matter is, there's no point being depressed because it doesn't make any difference. The only thing that makes a difference is doing something. So, that's my spiel, and I'm sticking to it. Okay, thanks a lot.
Sally Jones from Peace Action New York State who's been very involved in the Move the Money campaign as well, is going to be talking. Thanks very much, Sally.
I'm really delighted to be here. My name is Sally Jones from Peace Action Fund of New York State. I came over from Staten Island, and I have to tell you, we're very, very close. When you get off the ferry at South Ferry and take the R, it's about a 3-minute ride to Court Street, and you can miss that stop. So we have to remember how close we are and work together. That's how I got started in the Peace Action, was through my local need to start something in Staten Island, and we formed a Peace Action of Staten Island chapter in 2002, which is how I met Charlotte Phillips and eventually Tara and many people in this room. So I am really pleased to be here. And walking up from Court Street, you look across the street and you see this building in the middle of trees and flowers, and it's an oasis, and it just visually reflects, I think we should reflect on what it is that we're about here. In the middle of all the craziness of the world, there is this oasis, and there is these people here in this room who care so deeply about these issues and are willing to put their whole lives on the line to work for a better world. So I applaud all of you in this room. So I think Bill Hartung really points us to what the real collusion is. The real collusion is the world military industrial complex, and you can add all the things that are in there. And they've been very, very successful at keeping that going, and it has been a real struggle ever since I've been a child of trying to chip away at it. And I think that what you raise is it has to be done bit by bit by bit, starting at the local level, just like the nuclear freeze movement started at the local level and built up. The same thing has to happen here. I just came back from a trip around New York State from New York City up through the Hudson River Valley, up to Albany, over across the Thruway, Syracuse, and over to Buffalo, and down through the south and center, Geneseo, which is near Rochester, Ithaca, Binghamton, and then back to New York. And all these people in these towns all over New York State, and I'm sure all over the United States, who are just like us, who are in smaller groups because they're smaller towns, and they are latching on to some kind of campaign that will trigger their imagination. And it may not be a Move the Money campaign, it might be Back from the Brink, the Back from the Brink campaign, or some other campaign, but they're looking for something that they can do locally, that they can affect their local municipality and get the message out. I think people are thinking along those lines. Maybe this is just one part of the puzzle, and when I look at all the different things that are out there, we've worked on cost of war. There's been campaigns about the cost of war since 2002. We've had Move the Money types of campaigns trying to address how we can get the money out of the Pentagon budget. We've got the Divest from the War Machine. We've got the Back from the Brink campaign. We have Don't Bank on the Bomb campaign. There's others. Maybe some of you know of some other campaigns that are out there, which are all trying to draw attention to this huge problem, the real collusion that we're trying to address. So in New York City, we have a coalition that it's starting, I hope, to capture the imagination. Because it's local, because it has to do with legislation, because we can talk to our city council members, because we have a platform here in the city to raise this issue in the media. So our New York City Move the Money coalition is putting forward a city council resolution, which is very easy to remember. It's 747 after the jet. Just remember 747. It was talked about for a year, and they finally found a city council member who would introduce it, Edanis Rodriguez from Northern Manhattan. He's introduced this resolution. I don't know if we have a copy out there, but it has about 16 whereases in it. And the whereases are very particular to New York City. And I think that's what's the key to this, is bringing this issue back to our locality. What this real collusion on the military spending means to us. So it goes through the budget. It goes through basically what we heard from Bill Hartung about how big it is, about how it's growing. And then it talks about exactly what it's doing to New York City. People may not realize that we rely on federal grants in New York City for a number of things, that 85% of the HPT budget comes from federal funds, that we have money that is used for the home energy assistance program that helps 770,000 New Yorkers, that we get money in community service block grants that help, this is important for rental assistance, for summer youth programs, for adult literacy, and then there's the social services block grant, which helps meals to seniors, helps victims of domestic violence find shelter, and on and on and on. So with this kind of specific language, we can talk to our city council members and explain to them that when the federal military budget grows, that means that the social services are going to be cut, unless they grow the whole thing together, and then our tax bills keep going up and up. So that is a conversation we can have with our city council members. They know about these numbers. They are dealing with these numbers every year when they address the city budget. So I think that it's a real great tool to start the conversation and get people thinking about the money that we rely on from the federal budget, but also the fact that there's so much money being spent on the federal budget in the military side, that if it was less, that money itself, just cutting it by 10%, would free up a huge amount of money. Like 10% of 700 billion would be $70 billion. Where could that money go? And what could it be used on? In this resolution, it said that a 10% cut in just the Department of Defense budget would bring health care for 850,000 children and for 200,000 vets. That it would bring in 46,000 infrastructure jobs and 25,000 elementary school teachers. Now that's not or, that's and. All those things together would happen. Our ask is for all of us to start contacting our city council members and asking them to look at this resolution, look at what it means to New Yorkers for having such a large military budget, and really hurting and affecting the lives of New Yorkers here, and then ask them to put their names on it, to co-sponsor it. And then we get this city council resolution passed, but we don't end there. We bring this issue up at every chance we get. We can take little bits of this resolution and put it into any kind of action that we have, any kind of material that we're sending out. You know, we just use it in our work, and we bring other groups along with us. And our objective is to have public hearings. Our objective is to have public hearings where this becomes public information that is heard by a number of people. The people who are affected by cuts in social services or could be affected by cuts in social services come and testify what that means to them in their lives. I mean, there's other things we can do. We can be as creative as we want to be, or as creative as our coalition and their ideas brings to it. And you know, I heard somebody shout out the subways. You know, we're trying to find ways to figure out how to deal with these subways, and nobody seems to come up with the money. I think they're doing congested pricing, which maybe that will solve the problem. But you know, people say we don't have enough money. Well, look at the federal military budget. There's a huge amount of money there. And we're spending so much to continue these endless wars. People don't often think about the price tag that's attached to all of that. And when I heard $5.9 trillion we've spent since 9/11 on all of the wars with all of the other costs for the veterans associated with that, it's outstanding. It's just unbelievable. We need to bring that money home and really educate ourselves and educate everyone about it. Now, one idea that I think might help a little bit is if people, when they got their tax bill said, you owe us $10,000 or $5,000 or $1,000, and half of that is going to the military, and 25% of that is going to something else. I mean, we should actually know, when right now we fill out our tax form, we send it in. I think we should get a bill that says, this is what you owe, and this is what it's being spent on. We should always know what our money is being spent on, and we don't. All right, thanks. Okay, so let's link these campaigns. Let's start from the bottom, and I hope everybody fills out a postcard tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sally. And all of you in Brooklyn for Peace, if you're on our email list, you'll be hearing a lot more about the campaign to move the money in this campaign. And our final speaker of the night is Jan Weinberg, who's here with CodePink's Divest from the War Machine. He is a founder of Stand Up America, and he's going to be talking about the CodePink campaign. And it's similar to Move the Money, but not exactly the same thing. And he'll be talking to us about that. And then we'll have a few minutes for Q&A for our speakers tonight. And then, as I said, we'll break down into working groups so that we can start, the people who came out tonight can start to come up with actions that we can do.
My name is Jan Weinberg. I'm the founder of Show Up America, an organization that teaches individuals and organizations how to interact with their municipal governments, county governments, state governments, the Senate and House of Representatives, and the presidencies. A year ago, I joined up with CodePink's Divest from the War Machine Coalition, and I have been full-time peace activist ever since. Our campaigns are involved with bringing petitions to the House and Senate offices to ask our representatives to pledge to not take funds from the top 5 arms manufacturers and the NRA. So we actually have actions in Congress where we go into the offices. We have a number of House of Representatives that have done this. So far, there is no senators who are running for president that have accepted this pledge. But a number of House of Representatives who are running for president have accepted the pledge, and we're still at it with Divest from the War Machine. It is very exciting to be working with CodePink. If you've ever seen the video clips of the actions, it's quite exciting, and I'm no longer jealous of not being involved in that way, in getting in front of the powers to be and getting thrown out of their meetings. It is quite exciting. It's great to organize, it's great to have education forums, but it is absolutely incredible to be on the street. In Princeton, I'm heading up the Divest from the War Machine campaign to put it to Princeton University's $25 billion endowment for them to study it and then to sell any investments that have any arms manufacturers' investments in there or anything related to violence. The problem that I'm facing in Princeton is our municipal government gets a $3 million a year pilot program in lieu of taxes from the university. So our mayor said to me straight out, I'm not going to help you, which is kind of outrageous. The new trustee director for Princeton University happens to be Joshua Bolton, not to be confused with the other Bolton. Joshua Bolton is the chairman of the Business Roundtable, the most powerful lobbying organization on this planet. The arms manufacturers, every single one of them sits on the Business Roundtable. That's the powers to be. When we set up our students, faculty, and staff to work with us, and we have our press conference in Princeton, which is what we're planning to do, basically my life will be over with, or my career will be over with, but I'll be a constant target. Because everyone in Princeton's taxes are going to go up, because the university is going to stop giving them money, because we're going to hit them real hard. In Philadelphia, we have a divest campaign that's going to the college campuses and Philadelphia. I'm also working with the Philadelphia group, and I'm working here with the New York City group. On May 3rd, that's coming up at 9 o'clock in the morning, we have a campaign outside of BlackRock's headquarters during their annual shareholder meeting. BlackRock is heavily invested in weapons manufacturers. I am going to be in their shareholder meeting. By accident, there was a stock that divested. I ended up with BlackRock shares, and they invited me to go to the shareholder meeting. So I'm going to be putting to Larry Fink, are you intending to sell any investments in weapons manufacturers, or how we put it, stop making a killing on killing? And I'm going to put it to them. There'll be media people there, and it's going to be very interesting, but I'm going to say, are you aware of all the people who are outside May 3rd, 40th East 52nd Street? You're all invited to come. Bill, I listened to what you said about war with China would be World War III. Actually, if there's anyone left around, it's going to be called World War the Finale, because it's going to be over for humanity. And we are on the verge of war with China. Most people do not know of the results of President Obama's Pivot to Asia initiatives, and how there was enhanced military-to-military exercises, enhanced military bases, new military bases, and vast weapon sales. There was not a single member of Congress that voted against the Asia Reaffirmation Initiative of 2018, which President Xi of China reacted to, saying that he ordered their military on full alert against the United States to be prepared for war. That means everyone who's running for for president right now voted for that initiative, which is very alarming. When I was 15 years old, which is 50 years ago, my father said to me, if you study current events long enough, that you will know history. When I told him that I was doing full-time peace activist work 3 years ago, he said, get my iPad, look up Eisenhower's farewell speech. And I brought it up, and he said, beware of the military-industrial complex, solar and subtle influences. And he said, that was not in the original script. It was beware of the military-industrial congressional complex. But Eisenhower eliminated that part of it. Ever since, I've been studying the money that goes into the pockets of the senators that come directly from the arms manufacturers, the think tanks that the Senate brings in for their hearings, and the funding that they get, Center for Strategic and International Studies, is heavily funded from the arms industry, and they're brought in all the time to speak to the senators who happen to get the same money from the arms manufacturers. So what do we do with knowledge like this? Will this motivate us to do anything different if we have the knowledge about exactly how corrupt our government is? One of the problems that we face is that the media never comes out to the peace movement actions because it's peaceful. They tend to only come out on the streets when there's violence or disruption. I believe one of the problems is the advertising from the arms manufacturers that go into every mainstream media outlet. And it was disgusting to discover these things in my studies. But that is part of our problem about why they won't report on these things, because they will be out of business. The Hill, Politico, and Roll Call, which receive advertising revenue all of the time from the arms manufacturers, those newspapers are delivered every day into every congressional office. Why do they do that? It's to say we have the promises of the revolving door through the staff members in Congress. What can we do when we have any more knowledge like that? Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals. That is in Eisenhower's farewell speech. I have 50 years of knowledge now. It's about time that I have some wisdom on how to organize the peace movement. So now I am working with CodePink, World Beyond War, Win Without War, Beyond the Bomb, and our newly formed Peace Congress, which is a coalition of coalitions. Fairly soon, peacecongress.org is going to be coming out. We intend to mobilize the media and the citizenry in the United States. Thank you.
I wonder if there could be some words that address the black part of the Pentagon budget. I don't personally call it the military-industrial complex anymore. I call it the military-industrial surveillance complex. We talked about how the Pentagon has never passed an audit, which I understand is contrary to the Constitution. And then there's some recent accounting changes that have been passed, which now make it all right for the budget to dissemble when it's covering black ops. The Pentagon budget is basically a very leaky budget. So for instance, on September 10th, the day before September 11th, it was announced that there was trillions of dollars missing from the budget. So there's huge amounts that are just never accounted for.
There's some sort of intrepid researchers who are better at this than I am, have kind of like delved into the Pentagon budget, and they found these little peculiar code words and things that didn't seem to attach to anything else. But through that method, they think there might be $80 billion in secret programs tucked away in the Pentagon budget. Also, some researchers believe that the whole intelligence budget for CIA, National Security Agency, the 16 intelligence agencies the U.S. government maintains, is also sort of sprinkled around other parts of the budget, including in the Pentagon budget. So if there was a real audit, some of these things would have to come to light, which is probably one of the reasons that they've never done it. And, you know, the demand from Congress should be, it's the people's money, we need to know how you're spending it. And I think, you know, the issue that you raise is not really brought up that often anymore. There was a time when people would hammer on that more than they are. But I think, you know, I'm glad you brought it up.
What do you advise about the problem of congressional people who think that maybe they should raise the level of defense spending because that would then allow them to raise the level of domestic programs according to the legislation which I think mandates a sequester? So I don't quite know where that is in the Congress right now, but I'm wondering both where it is and also how you would advise to attack that.
Yeah, it's one of those things that could only happen in Washington. When the Republicans threatened to shut down the government under Obama, they made a deal called the Budget Control Act. And they were supposed to cut $1 trillion over 10 years, both from the Pentagon and from domestic spending, you know, $1 trillion each. But what they did is they came up with all kinds of loopholes for the Pentagon, so they got much more money than the domestic side. But what Democrats did was, well, you know, so there's these caps, right? So they said, okay, we'll give the Pentagon their pound of flesh. You know, you can have your increase above what the caps say if we can throw some money at domestic programs. And it's never equal. There's always more for the Pentagon than there is for domestic. But the Democratic leadership felt they were over a barrel, and that to at least beat back some of the harshest cuts that were being put forward, they would have to compromise on Pentagon spending. So there was a bill to do this recently that the Democratic leadership brought up. Trump wanted 750 billion. They were going to settle at 733 billion, which is a very marginal change. So basically they were sort of saying, all right, we're going to give up at the beginning. We're not going to fight this budget. And the progressives in the Democratic Party said, no, you can't do that. This is a bad bargain. We're not going to support this. And they had to pull the bill from the floor. So I think we need to build in the progressive ranks and say, enough with this sort of devil's bargain, more for the Pentagon, more for domestic. We have to cut the Pentagon and free up money for domestic. Now that would mean legislation, because you've got this Budget Control Act, which expires in 2021. So after the next presidential election. But I think that's what we should be fighting for, because otherwise, basically, it's almost like a form of, I don't know if it's bribery or hostage taking. It's basically like either you give the Pentagon its money, or we're going to slash domestic programs, we're going to slash diplomacy, we're going to slash environmental protection. So it's not a real choice being offered. But the only way to topple that is to challenge the premise and to say, no, we're not going to make that deal anymore. And we're going to have legislation that says cut the Pentagon and move the money to things that we need. So it's a tough fight, but I think it's encouraging that there are some members now who are willing to buck the leadership on this very issue. And so I'm hopeful that we can build on that.
Of the many presidential candidates, are there any that have addressed this outsized Pentagon budget and its usage? Do you know, any of you know, of some of the many good groups you've spoken about? Have they attempted to meet with the various candidates?
Well, there's groups like Win Without War, Public Citizen, sort of a coalition of us trying to reach out to all the candidates on the Democratic side and push a platform of cutting the Pentagon budget. So far, Elizabeth Warren has criticized the Pentagon. She said they're spending too much. She's gone after the corporate angle, corporate corruption. Bernie Sanders has given some speeches on it. I haven't seen him commit to a number, though, a number for cuts. So I think there's work to be done. It's completely unbalanced if you're going to say, we're going to do Medicare for all, we're going to do a Green New Deal, and we're going to let the Pentagon run riot over our budget. So I think we do have leverage with them. But I think it's going to take some pushing. And some of the coalitions that are working on this have gotten agreements from candidates in the past on things like government ethics reform and other issues. So I think this is the time to start reaching out to them. They're going to start having debates in June, which is unbelievable. The Poor People's Campaign is holding a debate, inviting all the candidates in. And they're going to raise this issue with them because it's one of their pillars of their their platform. So I think, there's a lot of work to be done. But I think there's some candidates may be receptive if they get enough pressure.
Thank you. The next questioner.
Prior to the end of the Cold War, we had a rationale for a military buildup, but right after that, all of the presidential candidates seemed to mention a peace dividend at that time, and it was very popular to talk about a cut in defense spending, but when they were elected, they usually had a turnaround on that, and we never actually had any of those things come to pass. But has anyone been contacting the primary people who are gearing up now?
Do you want to stick to that?
Yeah. There's a number of groups trying to make the case and connect with the campaigns and do bird dogging, where you go to their forums and people in the audience ask them questions about Pentagon spending. So I think we're going to try to find every angle we can, and that's where the local element is very important.
I can talk a little bit about the Peace Voter campaign that Peace Action does every, 2 years on the congressional and the presidential elections, and it's can be very local for each congressional district and also presidential. So we have an affiliate in New Hampshire, and they are already doing constant training to people on how to bird dog. And they did a training for us down in DC, March 20, I guess it was 24th or 25th, I can't remember which day it was. But it's really interesting. And we have an opportunity in New York City, because I asked Will, who's the man who does the training, and he said all the candidates come to New York City to get some money. And they're going to be at fundraisers. And if we had like a group of people who could like keep their eye out on the fundraisers that are happening in New York City and be trained to bird dog, as the candidates come into these events or leave, or maybe even some of their donors that come in, we can raise these questions. And they also actually gave us a series of really good questions to ask, and certainly military spending should be part of it.
And the New Hampshire groups get a lot of the stuff on tape, and it's really fun to watch. You know, the back and forth.
Thank you. I see that our line of questions is growing, and we do want to get to our working group, so I think I'm going to cut it off now, and I would ask you to state your question briefly, because in line with this question, we want to, as I just said, together for a few minutes and talk about the kinds of things, the talents that you would like to be working on. Legislation and lobbying is part of it. I do have to put out a warning on behalf of Brooklyn for Peace, which is what is called a 501c3 organization. So we can't do anything at all in election, and we are limited to the amount of lobbying. So bird dogging itself, I think, is something that Brooklyn for Peace can't discuss, but certainly individuals are very able to do that. So next questioner.
Hi, my name is Cameron. I was really glad to hear that the resolution included a lot of things related to housing. I think it's a major issue in the state, and the tenant movement is extremely organized around the state. I was wondering if we can, if there's any sort of points that we could identify joint interests between real estate and the weapons industry. The other questions I had, and then I guess piggybacking on that is, because I know you mentioned housing, education, Medicare as some major other areas we could be spending on infrastructure. What are the connections between, like, for instance, or can we form connections with, like, the nurses, Alliance for Quality Education? I'll cut it there.
That's really great what you brought up. I think we have just started the process of reaching out to housing tenant groups and people. I couldn't quite catch the name of the group you were with.
Housing Justice for All is statewide.
Okay, Housing Justice for All. That sounds like we should have a conversation. There's people here that are involved. Tom Gogan, raise your hand, Tom. And me, and Matt, and where's Matt? Back there. So make sure you talk to one of us before you leave, because we would like to have you part of the coalition, because that I think I said 85% of the HPD budget is from the federal government. And, you know, I just don't want to spend time on that, but that's the direction that we need to go in. Thanks.
I will ask this question in detail in person, but you don't need to answer it now. Do you have a feeling that you are asking too little from the wrong people? There are some people in this movement who think that nation states are not legitimate, and representative governments are not really representative. Even if they were, they wouldn't be legitimate. And some people may think that security concerns are not limited to armed forces, etc. And we should be asked to do more for global security concerning many different aspects of life, not just military stuff. Natural disasters, famine, etc. And we are being asked too little, so we should demand that there should be organizations where we do more work. It's not just about money, it's also about time. So in general, I mean, I can't give a lot of details, but I assume that there are many anarchists, let's say, in these movements. I'm not one of them, but, so this is a broad coalition, but in the end it gets to be, asking from representatives certain, percentages. I think there's more to what we are trying to do than just asking for percentages, asking for money from going from here to there, whatever. So once again, you don't need to answer it now, but if you do feel that you're asking too little, are you willing to work with crazy people? Maybe I'm one of them, but anyway. And, in general, is there some kind of self-censorship? If so, is there anything you can do about it? Once again, you don't need to answer it now.
Yeah. Well, a lot of people think I'm crazy, so we should definitely work together. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we need a positive agenda, and moving money around on a page is not enough. And I don't think I maybe have done enough to communicate that. And I think we need to work with everybody who wants to make the world a better place. And I think there is an element in my work, because I work at a think tank, because we're trying to influence Congress and the federal budget and so forth, that sometimes it shrinks your vision, if that's what you're mostly working on. So I'm glad you brought that up. I think that's very important.
Hi. So is there any effort being made and resources put into organizing inside the military and supporting those who want to organize in the military, and the same with workers who work at Raytheon or General Electric or all these corporations? Is there any attempt made to reach and organize those workers who can have, I think, a much quicker and more deep impact than we've been having this discussion for 40 years? Thanks.
Does anyone feel?
Yeah, I don't really know. I mean, there's a lot of activated Veterans for Peace. There's a group called Common Defense. There's Vote Vets who are raising these issues. But in terms of people still in the military, I know there's a guy named Danny Surgison who writes for The Nation and Tom Dispatch and various progressive publications, and is probably to the left of me on a lot of issues. He was writing this stuff when he was in the military, and somehow they let him do it. He had to clear it with them. He's just retired. He said there's a network of people like him in the military, like mid-level officers, who believe that our military policy is completely off base. We shouldn't be fighting endless wars. We shouldn't be wasting this money the way we are. We shouldn't be assuming America has the best of everything. We should be cooperating, learning from other countries, and so forth. But I don't know how much of that there is. And in industry, I haven't seen it. There was a time when the machinists and UAW were willing to talk about converting the military industry to civilian production, at least having plans to do that if the time comes. And there's a lot less of that. So I think that bears looking into, but I don't really know if there's anything significant going on that front at the moment.
I have a question, yeah. I have a question, maybe it's to us or to you in the audience, is we have all these campaigns, and some of them capture the imagination of one municipality or another, and they're different. But how can we make sure that we're all working together and we're not splitting our energies, and that we're all moving toward the same goal? That's my question. I don't know, maybe we can answer it.
Well, yeah, I think that's part of what coalition building is about, and I think it's not as easy as you'd like it to be, but I think that is also one of the goals of this Move the Money campaign, that this is just the beginning, that it's very small, it's very localized, but that it's bringing together racial justice, housing justice, climate justice groups, together with the peace movement, to see their overlapping concerns and that they're all different aspects of really the same overall problem, that the society is not being run for the good of the people who live in it.